My grandmother had been in pain for 3 straight days before she died. The kind of pain the hospice nurses stopped pretending the medication could fully manage. And then, in her final hour, with all of us gathered around her bed expecting the ending everyone had quietly prepared themselves for, she opened her eyes, looked toward the window, and smiled, wider and more peaceful than I'd seen her smile in years. None of us understood it at the time. My mother called it a mercy, the mind's last kindness before letting go. I believed that too for almost 3 weeks, right up until I found a letter folded inside the spine of my grandmother's Bible and understood that she hadn't been smiling at nothing at all. My name is Claire. I was 36 years old when my grandmother, Louisa Hartwell, passed away in April. And by the time this story ends, you'll understand exactly what she saw in that final hour and why an entire family had spent 60 years making sure nobody else ever found out. I need to explain something about my grandmother before I explain the letter, because the two things turned out in the end to be the same story wearing different clothes. Louisa was, for most of my life, the steadiest person in our family, the one who remembered everyone's birthday, who kept the recipe box that every holiday meal in my childhood traced back to, who had a way of sitting quietly in a room full of noisy relatives that somehow made her the center of it anyway. She raised my mother and my Aunt Denise largely on her own after my grandfather died young, ran a small dress shop downtown for almost 30 years, and never once in my entire life mentioned having any siblings. There was, looking back now, a particular kind of stillness that used to settle over my grandmother whenever the subject of her own childhood came up. A stillness I'd always attributed, the way children often attribute things they don't fully understand, to simple old-fashioned reserve. She'd answer questions about her parents in short, tidy sentences. My great-grandfather Harold described always in the same handful of respectful, distant words. Hardworking, strict, a man of his time. And then the conversation would gently redirect itself towards something else, so smoothly that I never once noticed, as a child, how consistently that redirection happened. She kept exactly one photograph of her own childhood displayed anywhere in her house. A formal portrait of herself alone at around age 12. And I remember once asking why there weren't more, and her telling me with a small practiced smile that most old photographs simply hadn't survived the years very well. I only learned much later how deliberate that silence had actually been. My grandmother's decline started slowly, the way these things often do, small forgetfulness that everyone in the family agreed to call ordinary, aging for longer than we probably should have, until a fall the previous winter made the truth impossible to keep gently ignoring any longer. She spent her final 4 months in hospice care, and I visited more often than most of my cousins. Partly because I lived closest, and partly, if I'm honest, because I'd always felt a specific closeness with her that skipped a generation in a way my mother occasionally seemed almost jealous of. I was in the room the afternoon she smiled. My mother Pamela was there too, along with Aunt Denise and my cousin Todd. All of us gathered in that particular exhausted vigil that surrounds a death everyone can see coming but nobody's quite ready for. Louisa had been mostly unresponsive for 2 days by that point, her breathing slow and labored. And then, without warning, her eyes opened, focused on something none of the rest of us could see, and her whole face relaxed into an expression of such complete, unguarded peace that my mother actually gasped audibly beside me. "Mom," Pamela said, leaning close. "Mom, can you hear me?" Louisa didn't answer, not with words, but she kept smiling. That same soft, radiant expression for almost a full minute before her breathing finally slowed further and 20 minutes later stopped entirely. The hospice nurse, a kind, weathered woman who had clearly witnessed this exact scene many times before, told us afterward that a final moment of apparent peace or recognition wasn't unusual, that families often reported loved ones smiling or reaching toward something unseen in their last moments, and that there were plenty of gentle, unprovable theories about what that meant. I accepted that explanation completely, the way you accept most explanations offered to you in the middle of active grief, without much appetite left over for questioning it. It was 3 weeks later, while helping my mother and Aunt Denise clear out Louisa's house, that everything I thought I understood about that final smile came apart entirely. The house itself felt strange to move through that week, familiar in every physical detail and yet already somehow emptied of the particular energy that had always made it feel occupied. Denise had brought a stack of flattened boxes and a color-coded system of sticky notes for sorting keep from donate from discard. And I remember feeling a small private resistance to that efficiency. The same resistance I imagine my grandmother might have felt watching her own mother's belongings get sorted decades earlier. Though I didn't yet understand how directly that comparison would end up applying. I found her old family Bible on the shelf beside her reading chair. The same Bible I remembered her keeping there my entire life, its leather cover worn soft and pale at the corners from decades of handling. I picked it up mostly out of sentiment, intending to keep it rather than let it go into the donation pile Denise had already started assembling in the hallway. And as I lifted it, a folded piece of paper slipped from somewhere near the spine and fell onto the floor at my feet. I almost didn't stop to read it right away. Denise called from the hallway asking whether I wanted the chair itself, and I nearly answered her first. Nearly set the paper aside for later, the way you set aside a dozen other small things during a house clearing that eventually never get looked at again. Something about the weight of the handwriting visible even folded, dense, and urgent in a way that didn't match the tidy grocery lists and recipe notes I'd found scattered through the rest of the house that week made me sit down right there on the carpet instead and unfold it immediately. I sat down right there on my grandmother's bedroom carpet and unfolded it, and the handwriting, careful and slightly slanted, unmistakably hers, stopped me cold before I'd even read the first full sentence. To whoever finally finds this, I hope it's someone who loved me enough to keep looking even after I'm gone, because I never found the courage to say any of this while I was still here to answer for it. I read the rest of that letter 3 times before I could make myself stand up again, and I remember distinctly the sound of Denise still calling something from the hallway about furniture, entirely unaware that 20 feet away, 60 years of family history had just quietly come apart in my hands. My grandmother wrote that she'd had an older sister, a woman named Eleanor Hartwell, born 4 years before her, who had essentially vanished from the family's history sometime in 1958, when Louisa herself was only 16 years old. According to the letter, Eleanor had become pregnant that year, unmarried, at a time and in a family where that fact alone was apparently considered catastrophic enough to justify what happened next. Their father, my great-grandfather, a man named Harold Hartwell, who I had only ever heard described in vague, respectful terms at family gatherings, had committed Eleanor to a state psychiatric hospital, officially diagnosed with moral insanity, a diagnosis the letter noted. In my grandmother's careful handwriting, was used with disturbing regularity during that era to institutionalize women whose behavior embarrassed their families for reasons that had nothing to do with actual mental illness. I had to read that particular passage twice before it fully settled. The specific clinical cruelty of a diagnosis apparently invented less to describe a mind than to silence an inconvenience. I thought about every family gathering where Harold Hartwell's photograph had hung, unremarked upon, above my grandmother's mantel. A stern, unsmiling man in a high collar that I'd never once thought to ask a single question about. And I felt something in my understanding of my own family rearrange itself permanently in the space of that single sentence. The family told everyone, including eventually Louisa herself, that Eleanor had died of influenza the following winter. Louisa wrote that she'd believed that story for almost 15 years, until a conversation with an elderly aunt at a funeral in her early 30s let slip a detail that didn't match the official version at all. A passing comment about Eleanor still being alive last anyone heard, spoken and immediately regretted in the same breath. From that day forward, according to the letter, my grandmother had spent decades quietly searching for what had actually happened to her sister, gathering fragments of information whenever she could, without ever telling her own husband, her own children, or anyone else in the family what she suspected. I was afraid of what it would mean about all of us, she wrote, if it turned out to be true. I was afraid of what it would mean about our father, about the family we'd all agreed to keep believing in. It was easier for far too many years to let Eleanor stay lost than to face what finding her again might force me to understand about everyone I loved. The letter's final paragraph was the one that undid me completely. 3 days ago, I finally received proof. Eleanor did not die in that hospital. She was released in 1974 after the laws finally changed enough to force an overdue review of cases exactly like hers. And she lived another 41 years under a name she chose for herself in a town 2 states away, surrounded by a family of her own that none of us ever knew existed. She passed 6 years ago, peacefully from what I'm told, having built a life I spent 60 years assuming was never given the chance to happen. I don't know if I'll live long enough to properly grieve this news or to decide what to do with it, but I wanted someone eventually to know the truth and to decide, with whatever courage I never quite managed myself, what our family owes the parts of her story we let ourselves forget. I understood, sitting on that carpet, exactly what my grandmother had been smiling at in her final hour. Whatever proof she'd received 3 days before that letter's final paragraph had apparently arrived again, somehow. In whatever way dying minds sometimes revisit the things that matter most, right at the very end. I didn't tell my mother or Aunt Denise what I'd found that same afternoon. I want to be honest about why. Because it wasn't only shock, though shock was certainly part of it. For the first time since my grandmother's death, I had something that felt entirely, urgently mine to understand. Something too large and too fragile to hand over. Before I knew what I was actually holding, I spent the following 2 weeks doing what my grandmother apparently hadn't allowed herself to do publicly for 60 years. Researching openly, methodically, determined to understand exactly what had happened to Eleanor Hartwell and where the proof my grandmother mentioned had actually come from. I started with a genealogist named Priscilla Vance, who specialized in reconstructing exactly the kind of institutional record that a family determined to erase someone might have left behind. Within the first week, Priscilla located admission records from Fairview State Hospital confirming Eleanor Hartwell had indeed been committed in October of 1958. at 19 years old, under a diagnosis that, as my grandmother's letter suggested, historians studying that era now recognize as a common euphemism for exactly the kind of moral transgression Eleanor had apparently been guilty of. These commitment records are more common than most families ever want to learn, Priscilla told me during our first phone call. Entire archives of women institutionalized for pregnancy, for depression after divorce, for simply being inconvenient to a husband or a father with enough money to arrange it quietly. Fairview actually closed in the 80s, partly because of a state investigation into exactly this pattern of commitments. Some of their records got transferred to a regional historical archive a few years back as part of an accountability project trying to help families finally locate relatives who vanished into that system. That accountability project, it turned out, was precisely how my grandmother had finally found her answer. Priscilla connected me with Daniel Osei, the archivist overseeing the Fairview records at the Regional Historical Society, who remembered, once I explained the situation, processing a research request from an elderly woman named Louisa Hartwell just over a month earlier. She came in person, Daniel told me, when I visited his office the following week, which surprised me given her age. Most people her generation send a grandchild to do this kind of digging for them. She sat at that table right there for almost 4 hours, going through everything we had on Eleanor Hartwell's case. I remember because she cried for the first hour and smiled for the rest of it, which isn't usually the order those two things happen in when people find what they're looking for in these records. I asked Daniel what that day had actually looked like, and he described it carefully, the way I imagine he'd described it to himself many times since, turning it over in his own memory once he understood how significant that visit had actually been. My grandmother had arrived alone, without an appointment, carrying a small folder of her own notes accumulated, she told him, over more years than I'd like to admit to a stranger. She'd asked, hesitantly at first, whether the archive held any records related to Fairview's 1958 admissions, and Daniel had walked her through the intake ledgers himself, page by page, watching her hand shake slightly each time a name didn't match the one she was searching for. When we finally found Eleanor's file, Daniel said, she went completely silent for almost a full minute. I've done this work for 11 years, and I still remember thinking I might need to call someone. She'd gone so still. And then she just started reading, out loud sometimes, mostly to herself. And somewhere around the discharge paperwork, I watched her entire face change. That's the part I keep thinking about, honestly. Watching 60 years of somebody's private grief just visibly lift, right there at that table. Daniel showed me exactly what my grandmother had seen that day. Hospital discharge paperwork from 1974 confirming Eleanor's release under the state's revised commitment review standards, along with a forwarding address that Priscilla, working alongside Daniel's archive, eventually traced forward through decades of public records into a name change, a marriage, 2 children, and a full, ordinary life, lived 2 states away under the name Eleanor Marsh. She built an entire life, I said, sitting in Daniel's office, still working through the shape of everything I was learning. A whole family, for over 40 years, and none of us ever knew. That's the part that gets people the most every time, Yanen, Daniel said. It's not usually the tragedy of the commitment itself that hits hardest. It's the ordinary happiness that happened afterward, invisibly, entirely without the family that caused the tragedy in the first place. It complicates the grief in a way people don't usually expect. I asked him, before I left that day, whether he thought my grandmother had known, sitting at that table, that she likely didn't have much time left herself to do anything further with what she'd found. He considered the question for a long moment. I think, he finally said, she came here already understanding this might be the only chance she'd get. I think that's actually why she came in person instead of waiting for someone to mail her an answer. Some kinds of news. I don't think people trust themselves to receive secondhand. Priscilla eventually located Eleanor's surviving children, both now in their 60s themselves, living within an hour of each other in the same town their mother had settled in decades earlier. I want to be honest that I hesitated for almost 2 weeks before reaching out to them, uncertain whether showing up in their lives, uninvited, carrying a family history their own mother may have deliberately chosen not to pass down to them, was actually a kindness or simply another version of the same intrusion my great-grandfather had originally committed against Eleanor herself. I finally called the older of the two, a woman named Judith Marsh, and explained as gently as I could manage who I was and what I'd found. There was a long silence on the line before she spoke. My mother told us almost nothing about her life before us, Judith finally said. We always assumed there was something painful back there she didn't want to revisit. She used to get quiet every October for reasons she never explained. I think now I understand what October actually was. I told Judith I understood completely if she needed time before deciding whether any further contact felt right, and she was quiet again for a moment before answering. I've spent my whole life with a mother-shaped question mark sitting behind everything she ever told us about herself, she said. I don't think I actually want more time. I think I've had 60 years of time already, without ever knowing there was a question worth asking. Before I flew out to meet Judith in person for the first time, I asked my cousin Todd, who'd been at Louisa's bedside the day she died, whether he wanted to come with me. He'd been quieter than the rest of us about the whole discovery, and I hadn't been entirely sure what he made of any of it. I keep thinking about that smile, he told me on the drive to the airport. I used to assume it meant she was seeing Grandpa or Grandma's own husband, someone already gone, waiting for her. It's strange, realizing she was actually thinking about someone still alive, out there in the world, completely unaware anyone was even looking for her. He was quiet for a moment. I think I want to come. I think I want to understand what she was smiling about, instead of just being told about it secondhand. Before that trip, the two of us stopped at the small cemetery, where our family kept its plots, standing for a while at Louisa's still fresh grave before driving to a different cemetery entirely, 2 states over, where Eleanor herself had been laid to rest 6 years earlier under her chosen name. Judith had given me the location over the phone almost apologetically, as though she wasn't sure it was appropriate to share. Todd and I stood there together in the quiet, reading a headstone that simply said Eleanor Marsh, beloved mother and grandmother, no mention anywhere of the name she'd been born with, no acknowledgement of the 60 years that had separated her from a sister who had spent decades quietly searching for exactly this address. She got a whole second life, Todd said, standing there, and an ending nobody in our family even knew to grieve. I think that's what Grandma finally got to see, I said. Not just that Eleanor survived, that she got to have all of this, completely separate from everything that was done to her. We drove it the rest of the way to Judith's house, mostly in silence, and I remember thinking, watching the highway unfold in front of us, that some kinds of grief only really finish arriving once you've actually stood at the right grave. Judith agreed to meet, cautiously at first, And over the following months, an entirely new branch of relationships slowly, carefully took root. Two families who had spent 60 years unknowingly existing on opposite sides of the same erased history, learning gradually how to actually know each other. I finally told my mother and Aunt Denise everything at a dinner I specifically arranged for that exact purpose, laying the letter on the table between us before either of them had finished their first course. Aunt Denise's reaction was the one I'd been bracing for. Why would Mom carry something like this alone for 60 years and never say a word to either of us? She said, her voice tight with something that sounded like hurt more than anger. We were her daughters. Didn't we deserve to know our own aunt existed? I think she was protecting all of us from exactly what we're feeling right now, I said. I think she also spent most of those 60 years not entirely sure herself. And by the time she finally had proof, she barely had the strength left to process it, let alone figure out how to tell you both. Denise pressed further, the way grief sometimes needs somewhere specific to land before it can settle. And Grandpa Harold, she said, our own great-grandfather. He had his own daughter committed because she was pregnant and unmarried, and this family just let that become a story about influenza. I grew up thinking he was some kind of quiet family hero because Mom always spoke about him so carefully. I don't even know how to hold both of those things about the same man. I don't think you're meant to hold them easily, I said. I think Grandma spent 60 years trying to hold them herself, and it clearly never got easy for her either. My mother had been quiet through most of the conversation, staring at the letter without touching it. I always wondered why Grandpa Harold's name made her go so still. Every single time it came up, she finally said. I used to think it was ordinary grief. I don't think that's what it was at all. She paused, turning her water glass slowly between her hands. I keep thinking about all the times I asked her, as a kid, why I didn't have any great aunts or great uncles on her side. She always said her family was small. I never once thought to ask her what small actually meant. We sat with that discomfort for a long while that evening, none of us rushing to smooth it over the way our family had apparently spent 60 years learning to smooth over exactly this kind of uncomfortable silence. It felt, strangely, like the most honest dinner the three of us had ever shared. The reunion between our two branches of family happened 6 months later, at a modest gathering Judith helped organize at her own home, and I brought the letter with me, along with a framed photograph Denise had found, while going through more of Louisa's things. A picture of two young sisters, arms linked, taken sometime in the mid-1950s, years before everything that followed. Judith recognized her mother's face immediately, younger than she'd ever personally known her, standing beside a great aunt she'd never once heard mentioned by name. She kept a photo almost exactly like this one, Zamwai, Judith said, studying it carefully. Same pose, different dress. I always assumed it was a friend from her hometown. I never once thought to ask who the other woman actually was. Denise and Judith spent most of that first afternoon sitting together on Judith's back porch, comparing the small handful of stories each of them had inherited about a mother and a great aunt they'd never fully understood, filling in each other's blank spaces the way only two people carrying opposite halves of the same buried history can. I watched them from across the yard and thought, not for the first time that year, about how much of my grandmother's final piece had likely come from imagining a version of exactly this afternoon, even if she never got to witness it herself. Fairview's Regional Historical Society, once Daniel learned how the family reunion had unfolded, asked permission to include a version of Eleanor and Louisa's story, in an upcoming exhibit documenting wrongful institutional commitments from that era. An exhibit specifically built around the accountability project that had, indirectly, made my grandmother's final peaceful smile possible in the first place. I agreed, on behalf of both families, feeling strongly that my grandmother's 60 years of quiet, solitary searching deserved to matter to more people than just the family that had originally caused the silence. I still keep that letter in the same Bible I found it in, though I've added something to it since. A copy of Eleanor and Louisa's reunion photograph, taken 62 years after the original, showing Judith and Denise standing side by side, two cousins meeting each other properly for the first time, arms linked in almost the exact same pose as their mothers had once stood. I've started keeping my own small folder now too, not of secrets, but of the ordinary details from both branches of the family. I don't want to risk losing the way my grandmother nearly let an entire sister disappear from memory altogether. Birthdays, favorite recipes, the specific sound of Judith's laugh, which turned out, remarkably, to carry an echo of a laugh I remembered from Louisa herself, some inherited rhythm that had apparently traveled forward through 60 years of separation completely undisturbed. I think about my grandmother's final smile often now, and I no longer think of it as a mercy the way the hospice nurse gently suggested, or as the mind's last kindness before letting go. I think she was simply, finally, allowed to see her sister's whole life laid out in front of her, ordinary and complete, and entirely undamaged by everything their family had once tried to erase. And I think that sight, arriving after 60 years of searching, was the single most peaceful thing she'd ever been given the chance to witness. If this story stays with you, I hope it reminds you that the families we come from often carry entire chapters none of us were ever told, waiting patiently in the spine of an old book or the corner of a forgotten drawer for someone willing enough to finally go looking. And if you've ever found something after a loved one passed that changed everything you thought you knew about them, tell us about it below. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story, because sometimes the truth doesn't arrive in time to be spoken out loud. Sometimes it only arrives in time for one last quiet smile.